Okay, hi everybody. This is a kind of late and sad evolution hour. The late part has to do with the sad part. Our dear, dear, dear friend Cy Strike, who alas I've never had a chance to meet in person physically, is dead. He died in a car accident today, and there's been rumbles of despair floating all around all the people that knew him. The reason why you're seeing me on this show is because he bitched at me to get and do that. And even though he's no longer around, all the people he touched are. And it's a terrible reminder and a spur to never take anything for granted for the moment. That whatever our age is or whatever our accomplishments, you do what you do the moment you can do it and try to do the best you can and influence as many as you can because thunk, you can be gone. Kaboom. And Cy reminds us that even though he's gone now, everybody who knew him and waited for his faux fury and waited for the little pug to show up um, are never going to forget him. So he's just as alive to us as if he were sitting there over my shoulder in a kind of a magic-y, spirity way. And that's how people actually do survive and proceed, is by the works you do and the people you touch and the ideas you put forward and the principles you show. And if you want to make a comment on that, Jackson, you may.
Yeah, Sai plugged me when I first got my channel started. The reason we're RJ and I are using OBS right now. I know how OBS works because Sai showed me how. We had a whole little hangout where he showed me all the parts of that, and I was not often a person who did movie night, but I did, you know, come on sometimes, and that was always a really good way to spend a Friday night or Saturday night, as sometimes the case was. And so
Yeah,
Cy will be dearly
his
missed.
his delight in science was infectious, and I hold it an extreme honor that he regarded that he learned stuff from me, and I will always be grateful for that.
Yeah.
So, the actual show, as usual, is the continuing saga of Contested Bones, a book of such monumental repetitiveness now, because they're now in the radiometric dating section, and now he's retreading masses of sources that he's already done, but now he's authority quoting them again, even longer. And I put some linkages up on some of the relevant materials so that we can deal with that. It all has to do, at one point, he references the dissertation of this one scientist. Why not just her paper in Science Magazine that she did afterwards on the thing? She was dating, she's one of the ones that were involved in redating the Sternfontaine STW 573 hominid down to 2.2 million years. Now, the last time I looked, 2.2 million years is still way before the 6,000 year creation of the Earth. So
Mm-hmm.
even if you go from like 3.4 down to 2.2, now that you're taking into account, the neat part about it, and what was fun, I put the linkage to the dissertation so you can read it, is how much care she was going through in looking up all the possible pitfalls in radiometric dating and figuring out how you get around them and compensate for them and deal with them, and how you can use clues from multiple techniques to establish a sound way of moving forward, which is the opposite of what we get with the creationists. It's a dead mark here. Oh, and by the way, I don't have the live feed and stuff up, so
Oh.
I have no clue
Oh.
what
Okay.
anybody is saying. If you want to, yeah, if you can put a little thing in the chat on that, then I can get that little puppy
Sure. Sure.
open
Sure. Sure.
too.
Sure.
I'm naked, as Psy Strike would be objecting to. People naked in the frame. And a viewer of last week's show suggested that we roast Jonathan Sarfati's 2010 book. And I found that available. And so that will be the one after Contested Bones is complete. And believe it or not, there will come a time when I will have finished, if I live long enough, that I will have finished the Contested Bones. Like Contested Bones, Sarfati neglects to put up a bibliography, although he's got a few references and they're pretty sparse. So I suspect it's going to be a much smaller bit going on, and it won't be anything new. It will be a retread, but it will be relevant for that purpose. So if you can put there we go. I'll just open that little dippy doop up in there, and one thing I have learned is desperation, never have dead airtime, is a cardinal sin. So you never want to have a point where somebody, that's a little bit of bone I could pick with, say, Bill Ludlow, who will have a thing where he's looking at material and there's sudden absolute deadly silence while he's looking at the stuff.
That
No,
does happen, yeah.
yeah, and so you always have to remember that the audience, regardless of whether they're actually looking, many people, as I often do on a lot of videos that are essentially talking head static, I can put it over to the side and be doing other things because I'm just listening to it, because there's just a icon on the screen, and what's the difference on that? But for the purpose of the audio part, no, you never, ever, 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 ever do that, and keep everything going smoothly. Oh, and a completely irrelevant point, but just because it's so damned interesting and I wasn't expecting it to. I'm not a great country and western fan, but Ken
Neither am
Burns's
I.
Ken Burns's history of country and western music that's running on PBS is superb as usual. It's an amazing story of the interconnections between that and black jazz and the side roots of vaudeville, and there's just interconnections that I'm going, oh gosh, that's interesting. Plus the human drama of it all is really quite amazing. So even if you cannot stand country and western music, I guarantee you will be edified and be amazed and delighted, especially when you find out. I already was aware of Flatt and Scruggs from my own personal background, and they popped up in one of my favorites of Spike Jones in the 1940s. And for those of you who have no idea who the hell Spike Jones is, Google him and find out. He was he was the kind of like a band version of Weird Al Yankovic, of where they would be parodying the music of the period. But anyway, Flatt and Scruggs appeared on there, and they were consummately skilled musicians. And I hadn't quite realized how brilliant a banjoist Scruggs was. He innovated a totally new way of playing off of a regional style that involved a high speed stuff that if you listen to comedian Bill Martin, God, I can't think of his name, Steve Martin, there we go. Steve Martin is like a glacier at speed compared to how fast Scruggs could do these things. And if you don't get your toe tapping listening to some of the music that's being performed in there, and the taxonomy that the musicians are doing, explaining why the stuff was so powerful, why chords were chosen the way they were, and why music was done. So yeah, just watch it and pay attention to that stuff. The world is an intriguing place, and you never know the things you discover. That's another lesson of Psy, is that you never quite find out the kinds of things you're interested in if all you're doing is kind of tracking in the same narrow path. There's I'm off on a terrible digression here, but it's worthwhile.
I'm sorry, we don't have Karis currently to pull you back.
Yeah, there's a radio show on our local PBS NPR channel every Saturday, the Saturday Cafe, and it's a 2-hour show where the guy goes and trawls through the most amazing records from all the cultures of the world, everything from Mongolian throat singing to little obscure rock bands in Albania, or it's astonishingly broad ranging. And it's the kind of thing that where you won't necessarily retain every bit of it, but it exposes you to a bigger world, because he's always talking about the political context of where they're coming from, the social context. Some of these people often have fled their countries because of political problems. A lot of the African and Asian musicians get in trouble with the regimes that way. And so you get this cross-connected cultural and historical framework in there at the same time. And if you have local channels and things that do that same kind of stuff, latch onto them, because they're wondrous ways. Even when I'm working on my projects, I'll be listening to the Saturday Cafe and bringing in additional things where I go, ooh, that's interesting, I didn't know that before. And that was the same spirit that you found with Psi. And I hope to instill in everybody, and Jackson has it. And it's the thing that you often don't find so much in Tortukans. They often are not curious, and they stay in their little rut, and they're missing the banquet of life that way. So back to isotope dating and all that. So the papers then that I put up in there are a nice little sampling. There's some material from John Woodhead. I love it. Don't you love it, Jackson, when the creationist cites the technical paper and then you go read the paper and you go, did you read this paper?
It depends on how you define the word love. What does
Yeah.
is mean, RJ?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we know that with James Cole. That's the gift that keeps on giving. But it's the same kind of phenomenon here where you look at how they're cherry picking. Always, they're trawling for ammunition. That's the main problem. And sometimes you get extended quotes from them where they're looking at everything that if you take it out of context, it will suggest a problem. This was an example from that Woodhead paper that I put the linkage up to from 2012 on uranium and lead variability in older speleothems and strategies for their chronology, which are kind of like deposits that are like stalagmites and stalactites, except they can be thin layered and all that. But they're basically accretions that get radioactive material in them. And theoretically, if you do your homework correctly, to isolate for uncontaminated ones can be used to date stuff. So you can even date caves where you've got hominid remains, which is what they've been doing in some of these things, and find an end run around it. Usually they're using uranium dating, but it turns out there's even techniques now where they can use carbon dating if there's carbon sampling in them and they're falling within the right time range and stuff. But anyway, all it turns out they have two very extensive paragraphs that Rupi and Sanford cited about controls on the movement of lead in the environment and its incorporation into calcite are relatively poorly known. And they're talking about all the limitations of this. And it went off. It's a big technical laden paragraph on page 106 if you look up in the PDF. And then the next section right after that on apparent and real uranium and lead contents of speleothems, also a long paragraph where they talk about ubiquitous contamination of anthropogenic lead in the environment and so forth. That was the stuff they quoted. But they didn't go into how much was being contaminated. And it turns out that it's perfectly intelligible. They didn't quote the end paragraph in just the immediately next one, which is these data suggest that typical speleothem calcite contains lead in the low lead range, and thus a great many speleothems should be amenable to the uranium lead dating technique, providing they exhibit some variation in parent-daughter ratio between subsamples, allowing construction of isochrons. Remember our wonderful little word, the isochron, which is a self-calibrating system that compensates for contamination and all that. And if the stuff is valid, you're going to get a nice straight line isochron that way. Funny how Rupi and Sanford decided not to quote that part from the paper that they just cited because it doesn't fit their paradigm. Isn't that amazing?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Shocked.
Yes, I know. You know this. That we should probably in future we should probably have. Maybe we could get it online. The little clip from Casablanca where Claude Rains says that line, which is one. We ought to really have that as a little blip if time passes. And this is a call out. I don't want to have to prevail on poor Jackson every bloody week on this. If somebody wants to help the old RJ, as Cy did to get me operating properly and act as co-host, frankly, somebody that can keep track of the things and queue up the videos and all that kind of stuff, because I am terrible at that. I'm a lazy bastard on so many of these things. It's a thing that I have limited memory on the computer and all this kind of stuff. And so it's a matter of just making do with the kinds of things that I have. So anybody out there that's got a Wednesday free that wants to help out on all of this stuff, and in lieu of having to become a Patreon or somebody like that to do some sweat equity time, hey, I'm here. So The other part of the thing that's in the remainder of the show has to do with some beautiful fossil horse stuff that isn't. That it pops up every once in a while. You've got a trope that popped up apparently from Walt Brown when I finally tracked down all of the things. Our good old friend Walt Brown was the guy that was putting this, and he was trolling some Russians who were talking about a supposed fossil that an old Soviet magazine that was riffing off of material done by somebody else that then gets filtered by Walt Brown and then gets quoted by Kent Hovind and a bunch of other ones that copy off of that. That there was supposedly a horse footprint back in the Triassic.
Oh,
This ought to
okay.
immediately raise your suspicions. And it turns out that there were tracks of things, of tetrapods, that apparently somebody described as looking a little like a horse's thing that you would see in a mammal. But when you actually look, I put the paper up from the only one that I could find by the scientist that was involved in this. And there's pictures, there's a variety of different tracks that are involved, but none of them really look that horse-like. And I think this was a daisy chain of people reporting on a general coverage that then got reported by somebody that didn't check their facts, and then it just cascades and gets repeated. And so what you found, I think, with the Kent Hovind case is that he was citing the Russian magazine version that was already a multiple secondary source. Oh, yeah, you've got to look at the primary material in here. So if anybody can find an example of an actual Triassic horse fossil, please let us know. I'm sure that would be an astonishing find that would make it into the papers, I'm sure.
I mean, that would push back super orders of mammals by over 100 million years. So,
Oh gosh, yeah. That's for those of you who have been following me on Twitter. Oh, let me see whether I've got my. Oops, wait a minute. I'm losing my little things there. I thought I had my pop-out menu out there, but it seemed to come on. Anyway, for those of you who have been following me on Twitter, you'll see that I'm continuing to do my relentless spread of the reptile-mammal transition, or RMT for short, or if you want a single thing, either probandignathids or therapsids. And I keep track of all the different people who I drop this on, and there are times when a creationist will pop into a thread, a new one, and I already have the notes on them. And so I can tell people when I told them about the RMT. And they're saying, oh, there's no evidence for macroevolution. Oh, hey, how about those therapsids? You know, I mentioned you to those back in November of 2017. How are you coming with those? And so the more you can get people directed onto that. And I was also happy when I see examples of people doing the reptile mammal transition stuff independently of me, that they have able to notice it on themselves. But everybody who does want to use that as an example, get my damn book, because I've covered all the field in there, and that allows you to be ridiculously smug, because you'll know everybody that ever did a reference on it, and including mainly John Whitmerap. That's the one nice thing about the reptile mammal transition. And Jackson, I'm sure you've discovered already in your own research how some things are available online and other books and things aren't. And so if that, when people, or not easily accessible, and that means if you put yourself in the mindset of the creationist and think through, oh, that snotty little evolutionist RJ mentioned the reptile mammal transition. How can I blunt him with a beautiful creationist source? And so they'll Google it. And this one apologist, Genesis, I think Genesis 1:1 is the thing she goes by.
oh
Anyway,
Lord.
she tried to bring up clumsily that there were reversing traits in the mammals. Well, I'm immediately sitting back and going, oh, you're referencing John Whitmerap, aren't you? Because that's literally the only place she could have got that from, because that's Whitmerap's argument. And he's cockamamie 100% wrong on it. And needless to say, nobody can get her to actually discuss the data. I even threw the other one that I put in there because it's readily accessible. The original text is available as an open access PDF on his website. Zheji Lo's thing on the mammal jaw from 2011 on the ear and jaw evolution. And it's a beautiful summary of a hell of a lot of stuff and a huge number of sources that are listed in it, and it's open access. And of course, what she did, she basically pulled the middle finger on it. Said, "Oh, that's just their mythical thinking." What? That's how you dismiss Lowe's paper, and all the information in it is with that? Well, what do you expect? So you get absolutely nothing out of that. Okay, hi BJ, hi Nana, hi Lisa. We got a variety of Vesta. I don't know if we missed, if I missed any questions and stuff or comments that are relevant to take note of. That was the thing that always was delightful about Sci-Strike show, is the stuff that's would pop up in the live chat where we'd get people going on about clams and all the rest. And I know Cy was just tickled by all of the stuff that would be going on. TD Lane says he's going to look at the paleontology courses available at the university near me. Haven't found something that's interested quite a long time, and I won't lose anything for looking. Yeah, not all universities have real paleontology departments. Our universities, I've got 3 here in Spokane, and one has a pretty good geology department, but not per se a paleontology division. So they're studying the rocks more than the bones in them. And then the other, Gonzaga, is a law school, and Whitworth is a Christian college that I think does basically general arts, although they have a small science department and all that. And I know that there were members in the science department that were really happy when Steve Meyer left.
Not surprised.
Well, he wasn't in the science department. He was
Well,
in
no.
philosophy.
Yeah, he's a philosophy of science, which is kind of ironic, but whatever.
And so they were happy when he bid them adieu. Since then, a lot of them have upgraded, because EWU was originally just Eastern Washington State College, and Whitworth was a college. Now they've gotten all fancy schmancy in their universities.
Right.
Anyway, so we've got. We might as well do, before we get to shameless plug point, we could give some material on what we've all been doing for The Rocks Were There, which we are zapping along with. I was telling, before we started up the show, I was telling Jackson about the Messinian salinity crisis, which is a wonderful time when the Mediterranean got locked off and the sea levels dropped and all sorts of neat shit was happening. And creationists have tended to avoid it. And it's also stuff how amazing things happen over 500,000 years and more, and the millions of years since then, without need of any gigantic global flood. And the capper on it is the most spectacular tourist attraction that nobody would have a chance to see, which was the Gibraltar waterfall, where the Mediterranean got separated from the Atlantic for a while and dried down an awful lot. And then finally the Atlantic bore its way through again, and in a period of about 100 years refilled the Mediterranean Sea. And it would have been the noisiest waterfall ever. Just imagine something that's 20 odd miles wide and about 2,000 or 3,000 feet tall, cascading down in this gigantic cataract. Unfortunately, the Australopithecines and that were not really good at tourism at that time, and so they hadn't invented designer luggage and holiday inns and that, so they missed their chance, and the damn thing got flooded in, and now it's all ocean again, sea, which is really quite interesting. Anyway, it sucked in this process masses of shrimp and critters from out in the Atlantic Ocean, like a giant suction, and so there's deposits of those on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea as well. So all that. Now, all of that's based on normal style uniformitarian catastrophism. It doesn't require the giant global flood, and it also doesn't require trying to synchronize all that information with everywhere else, because of all the things that would have to be going on at the same time as all of this stuff in the Messinian crisis, the salinity crisis, and try to figure out how you would do that. Well, that's part of the reason I think why even Michael Orr doesn't really come up with an explanation of when he kind of vaguely thinks this was after the flood, that this is a post-flood thing, in the same way that they think the Grand Canyon was technically carved after the flood, that the canyon wasn't actually carved out by the flood itself. The flood laid down the deposits which magically turned into rock in a way no one can figure out, even and especially creationists. And then this big upstream lake that they purport is there breached, like the Missoula lake that did the Scablands, and then carved out a canyon that does not in the slightest resemble the actual Grand Canyon, because we know what hyper flooding does, and it doesn't produce incised canyons. I was pointing out that there was some delicious evidence, and I think I'm going to put some linkages up to it in a later, maybe next month, show where it'll be because it's so fascinating. Is when you've got a differential, this is the reason why the Grand Canyon forms the way it does, is that what happens is you have water draining down into ocean or into lake in the case of an outlet that way. And if the differential between those two increases faster than the water can erode the track, it produces steeply incised and often meandering rivers as it's trying to work its way down, because gravity is relentless. Now, you can do this by two means. One is you uplift the land, which is what happens with the Columbia or the Colorado Plateau. But in the case of the Mediterranean, it was the sea level that dropped. And it went down hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet, half a mile, depending on which time frame and that you're looking at. And what happens then is it's a testable model. They can see incised channeling formed downstream from dams because that's changing the water level. And that's therefore putting up energy into the system that's different artificially. It's not quite as spectacular as what we would see from other areas, but you can measure it. And I got a paper that I'll be putting in the book on that as well. But the neat thing is that the Mediterranean is ringed with these incised valleys as the water level dropped. And so the water level was rivers that were emptying into them. The Nile, not the Po, as I was just describing, wasn't actually around at that time. The Rhone and the Urgo, I think, or Urbo in Spain, they had incised channels, not always where the river is now. Quite a few of them have the channels out in what used to be the mouth of the river, which is now underwater because the Mediterranean has filled it in. So they've got this wonderful science, of which a lot of it's only been done in like the last 5 or 10 years. So needless to say, there's more material for the creationists to catch up on. But we can see the physical effects of all of these natural phenomenon with the Mediterranean Sea. And this all pops up in relationship to the flood and why the channeled scablands of Washington State and the little Grand Canyon of the Grand Canyon that Jackson and I are discussing, that there really was a little Grand Canyon in the Nile that was 900 feet deep back millions of years ago, formed by the lowering of the Mediterranean Sea. Odd of that to happen just in such a meticulous way, in a way that makes sense in the biogeography of it, is what critters. They can even see the kind of animals and stuff. I think as marine paleontology gets better and people have little remote drones that can go down underwater and dig, that theoretically there's going to be more and more dredged up from these places where there were land above water at the time they were forming that you can't get to now because they're under 1,000 feet of water. But the little robots can do that. And so it may not happen in my lifetime, but in your lifetime, probably, Jackson, you're going to be seeing more in the way of marine paleontology, I suspect.
Maybe. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, it's a thing that is kind of inevitable as the technology advances. Look at how satellites have revolutionized archaeology, that you can see in the ground penetrating radar. They can detect whole cities that are invisible because they're grown over and there's no sign of it on the ground, but it stands out like the sore thumb. And when they excavate, they can find the roads and the structures that they can see from space. And then another thing is the weird phenomenon that occurs when when there are unusually wet seasons and little things start growing and sprouting, and there'll be the places where ancient buildings were will stand out in the little moss and crap that grows up, that it traces along the boundaries because the soil is compacted in different ways over them. So you get these fossil things that pop up like fairy rings that people can look at and then do excavations and go, oh shit, there was a thing there. So this happens all the time in there, and so that there are new techniques that they can use. You can view stuff in different wavelengths and see things that wouldn't be visible in one wavelength as opposed to another. So the technological tools that are being developed are just absolutely cool, and that means that the moving target of science is always going to be farther and farther ahead of the creationists. That they're going to be, all they're going to be seeing is the last tiny bit of the tail light as the science train or car goes around the corner.
Right. Yeah.
Let me do a brief pause here. I can't put the thing up because I'm not doing screen sharing, but let me read my thanks to everybody that's patrons, since we are at about half of the hour here. That we've got, thank you, Hendril and Eric and Suris, and our researchers, Travis and Convert Me and Eat Meal and Ralph and Pelagia, and Benjamin and Ugly German Truths, and our assistant researchers, Mike Apple and Duranku and James Fitzwater and Puffalophagus and Totis Real, and our friends Daniel and Stephen and Mary Gale and Insects Are Cool and Morton and Bo and Staggles and Alex and Paul, and then also legacy patrons who helped at sometimes but weren't able to continue for whatever reason, Jen and Jody and John and Keith and Andrew and Dyer and Yui and Mona and Brad and Daniel and Danya and Sun Sky and Everett and Sur and Zeshi. Every one of you that has helped is the difference between me scraping by in a panic and scraping by in less of a panic to where I can actually consider having food and ink simultaneously and paper to print it on even at times, amazingly so. So thank you all very much. I put the linkages as usual for my word process, the tortucanwordpress.com and the patreon.com/downwardtip and also gofundme.com DCGo. So if you've got some spare cash floating around that's burning a hole in the pocket, doesn't have to be a lot. Don't hawk the grandparents or the farm for that. But if you got like the price of a latte or something, or even $1 a month, it all adds up and help out. And that makes it easier to deal with things and allows the old RJ to continue doing research and projects, barring unforeseen circumstances of being hit by a truck or lightning bolt or something like that, which we know from SciStrike can happen literally any day. That I want to make the most of my time. Jackson, I'm sure you want to make the most of your time. And carpe diem, damn it. So what do we got on here in the... Vesta says, say it is not so that creationists cherry pick their data. Okay, Vesta, I will say that it is not so that creationists cherry pick their data.
Let's see. I've also been working on rocks recently. The stuff that I've been doing is more Menton. I think we're actually hitting Menton more than we're hitting anyone else.
Yeah, it's starting to look that way. He has a track record because he's been at this stupid longer than Georgia Purdom. Purdom was really only hitting into the field around 2000. But Menton is an old hand, and he has stuff going back into the 80s and 90s, which often get retread at Answers in Genesis. But then they make the mistake of letting him write recent chapters.
That's true. Yeah, it's very curious. So he is kind of their point guy on paleontology stuff because I guess they don't have an actual paleontologist, so they get him to do it for them, and he is hilariously bad at it. Like, it makes me question whether or not he reads the papers he cites. Because I finished the chapter on Tiktaalik, so I had to read both of the original papers by Shubin et al. On Tiktaalik.
Fun stuff, isn't it?
It's interesting. I was kind of aware of most of the transitional features of it, but I learned some stuff from the papers. It's kind of neat. One feature in particular was Shubin et al. Report that Tiktaalik didn't have an operculum. It didn't have a bony covering over the gills like fish normally have. You know, it's, they use it and they flush water out of the gills. Well, Tiktaalik didn't have it, and they supposed that the reason for this was it was kind of at the water's edge, where it's breathing a little bit of air, but also water, which is what a lot of fish today do also. But what's funny is Minton says, how did they know that it didn't have an operculum? And it literally says in the paper that they have 3 specimens and the imprint is fine enough such that they can tell on all 3 that it
Yeah,
has no operculum.
yeah,
What is hard about
yeah.
this?
And plus, what implication is he going to do on there? The it's even worse than that, because the subsequent work has been meticulous in looking at where they're finding these fossils and how they are routinely being found in this coastal tidal area. And that's one of the reasons why they're able to spread so far, is because they're in the shoreland and they can just boop, boop, boop down to the next zone. And then they've also even done analyses of like the oxygen isotopes that are trapped in the things, the various differentials there, to indicate that these things were probably pretty good at maintaining a good salinity balance, that they could stand salty water but also fresh water, which is another reason why these bunches eventually started adapting and ended up doing stuff on the land to where they didn't have to live outside of water at all. And of course, all that happened just instantaneously.
Right, of course. Can't have can't have anything uh going slowly or gradually. It has to all be very fast.
Yes, yes. And yet never quite working out, because they're aquatic creatures, you're not going to find them on the ark. So they can literally shunt aside in their head all of this material. And if you move over to intelligent design land, Casey Luskin has had pot shots on Tiktaalik and that as well.
Which is kind of weird because theoretically they should be able to accept these sorts of things.
It's the thin edge of the wedge, Jackson, because they've got an awkward problem to deal with. And this is the case that I noted in the old tip work, that there was a pattern about things, that even though almost everybody in the anti-evolution biz can't stand the idea of human evolution because it's conflicting with the religion bit of human beings created specially and recently, most of the anti-evolutionists don't dwell on human evolution. They're talking about other critters. And the reason why this was the case is because when you're starting into like the 1920s and 30s, you're starting to see the increasing number of fossils of hominids show up. Before that, you could argue, well, everything else evolved, but not people, and that they wouldn't have any evidence of it. All they had were Neanderthals, and some were arguing that those were just deformed Napoleon soldiers or something like that. They have ways of rationalizing that. But once you started seeing Australopithecines and that bunch, and it became clearer after World War II, the same processes that apply to trilobites and artiodactyls and dinosaurs apply to us, that any rule of speciation and adaptive evolution and microevolution turning into bigger things, that you would deal with any of those other groups. Well, when you turn to humans, how can you keep them from being applied to it? You can't. So they're forced by the logic of human specialness to basically draw their lines in the sand to prevent any serious evolution from going on. Otherwise, they've got the problem with how they deal with how do you get the difference between humans and that. And remember, the creationists are the ones that step into this minefield
Mm-hmm.
because they've got to work out kinds, whereas the intelligent designer and the old Earth creationists don't have to do that.
Which, humorously, interestingly enough, which is also kind of humorous, I think, Minton tries not at all to talk about kinds. He doesn't bring up it at all. Because he brings up lungfish. By the way, I actually saw a lungfish this week. It was pretty neat. Yep, he brought up lungfish, coelacanths, Pandorictes, Eusthenopteron, Tiktaalik.
Visual.
So he doesn't attempt to put any of these into kinds. None of them. He doesn't bring it up at all.
Yeah, yeah. He actually, as you will recall from the Baraminology chapter, is that Minton really isn't a player there either.
Mm-hmm.
That it's those that Kurt Wise, Todd Wood, and Kavanaugh, that bunch that and the M. Aaron, whether it's a male or female, we're not quite sure. They're the ones that are
Mystery
actually
Aaron.
kind of the mystery Aaron. that are trying to deal with it. And you got to give them props. They're trying to be sciencey. Oh, they're trying so hard, but they're facing an incredible problem. So I can easily see where Menton, his brain would just kind of go, oh, I don't want to really think about that. And probably because he thinks he has his case made in his little apologetic shots that he does fire. The reader of the new book, however, will discover with delicious detail just exactly how frequently Menton blows his own feet off with his own sources.
It's true. That has been especially common with the first section of the chapter I'm working on is Tiktaalik, that chapter. So then the next one is Menton goes after the concept of transitional fossils generally, and he quotes a bunch of papers, mostly from the 80s, of course. Nothing, can't have anything too recent.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, probably because a lot of the stuff he was doing back at that time, and he's not bothered to do any work since.
Right, but the papers are actually quite interesting. It's usually stuff regarding punctuated equilibrium and a few other theories, which at the time were seen as more controversial, and they're treated that way in the papers he cites. But
Yeah,
there's nothing
but that's 30
anti-evolutionary
years
about
ago.
it. Right, that was
Yeah.
also 30 years
I
ago.
apologize to Benjamin Simpson, who says that I was moving in and out of range of the microphone, so I was starting to fade out and all of that.
It roller coasters on your end. I don't know why, but you'll be very quiet. You'll just be sitting there, and it's like very quiet. Then it's loud. Then it's quiet.
Well, apparently the microphone is precise enough that if I move slightly where I'm sitting, and I tend to slouch and I pull back and do all sorts of things naturally.
It did it right just then. You're sitting in the same spot, and it's just coming in and out. I don't know why.
It's demons.
Creationists in the wires, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we will persist anyway. But yeah, Menton. The thing that you learn about Menton and virtually any other creationist is never take anything they say at face value. That even if they offer a source on it and it sounds like maybe they might actually be legitimate, don't assume that it's so, because as we're going to be showing with the whole section on vestigial organs, Menton can really jump off the gangplank and be so far removed from the facts of his own sources that reading it is just a delight. First, you learn crap. Holy moly, you learn so much stuff.
Well,
and
reading the Menton isn't the delightful part.
Yeah, well, I'm an old fart, and plus it's the essence of source methods. One of my sisters once asked me, how do you manage to read so much Philip Johnson without vomiting? And I go, well, it's because I got to do that. Because when you look at, if you have a person writing a article or a book as an isolated blip, that could be just the isolated blip. But if you have them writing 50 articles and 8 books, and they're repeating the same tropes and never investigating, and they're going decades with this, that's a pattern of behavior. And that's very diagnostic about what's going on or not inside of their noggin. That isn't the case if you're only looking at a single isolated example of their work. And that's the delightful and dreariness of scholarly analysis, because it involves processing stuff. But it means that you can gauge behavior. That when you go, the other bit, of course, is the Dracula rule on when people cite sources that contain information that blow their argument to smithereens. And they only cite it maybe for an authority quote or whatever. Well, the moment they cite that work, they're open. Because if you cited it, maybe you were lazy and only saw the abstract, that doesn't do you any good, because you cited the technical paper. And so we can assume fairly that either you didn't read the paper at all, or you're manipulating it because it clearly says the opposite of what you just said. And so you have them hoist on a petard of their own making. That wouldn't be the case if they were just doing generic boilerplate, which an awful lot of people do in social media. So there's an advantage to that. You get a different flavor when you're dealing with the video ones. Your Standing for Truths and your Kent Hovins and all that bunch that are delivering what might sound like detailed material, but they're often having authority quotes or like, what was his name? Long something or other.
Oh, long
Um,
story short.
Long story short, that essentially he's just trawling intelligent design apologetics. And he thinks he's actually dealing with other people's arguments. But I think it's only to the point of where he's kind of glancing in and reading bits and pieces to confirm that the authority quotes from the intelligent designers are valid.
Yeah, I
And
don't. I think that as far, which it's interesting because it seems as far as what he's read is he goes, oh yes, they definitely treated this subject. Well, his idea of them treating it is just reading them, is
yeah,
not really reading the original technical material. It seems.
yeah. Well, look at the famous Darwin quote. Well, there's several Darwin quotes. The one about the eye is one of the most obvious one.
Yeah,
But by and large, I would use as a rough heuristic that 90% of the people easily who quote the Darwin I quote have got it from a quote mine. They've
I'd give it
never
100%.
bought, well, I'm charitable.
I mean, if there's no way they can read, because it's the next sentence that refutes it. I mean, there's
Oh,
no
but
way.
remember the Tortugan mind. The Tortugan mind literally shuts down. It's looking for ammunition. And so you find, just as this example that I noted with Rupi and Sanford from this paper from Woodhead, that they're going after stuff that fits their paradigm, and when plucked out of context, says what they want to be true, and so it becomes what they want to be true. And there can be umpteen pieces of information in there that conflict with that, but their eyeballs are probably not even processing it. Their brain is going, no, no, you don't want to think about that. Oh, there, now that's much better. There you are. Now you feel better. And I actually think that's kind of what's going on in their head on that. Now it gets to be pathological in certain cases, well, I've been seeing that with hacking, that nincompoop on Twitter, who is just gobsmackingly stupid. And you find they're rarer than you might think. That you find the ones that are the most annoying are the ones that just have their tropes, and I think they even have them on cut and paste files, to
Probably.
where they've got the same memes and the same shtick over and over and over again. They're the ones also. If you're in social media, beware of people changing their screen names. And so what you want to look for is the original core that they're using, and they keep that because they have only the one screen name, but they change what the public version is. And you find that some of these ones, Jackal is currently he's called that, and there's hacking. His current screen name is the Rock Whisperer. What the hell that means? No, I think he's referring. I think it's an oblique reference to the Rock of Ages. So it's your Petros, St. Peter kind of thing. But I think he's an older guy hacking, and obviously an incredibly clueless one, and maybe short-term memory deficits because he tends to forget an awful lot about things. He trots it out.
Well,
And
he could also just be a troll, RJ.
yeah, yeah, there are a few of those. Cassandra is one of those, and then there's just hit up their ass annoying, like positivism versus negativism and all of that. But
I don't know. I think standing falls into that category.
well, I'm very charitable. I can see him. He has a preconceived things he wants to be true, and it is a young Earth creationist dogma, and he feels that he's doing his duty by carefully copying down the arguments and the sources for them, and then the jargon, and being able to repeat them efficiently. And in that respect, he's very attentive. But the problem is, as you've discovered as well, when you ask him about to apply his concepts to data that's outside of the boundary of what he's been reading in his apologetic literature, he's screwed because he has no idea what any of it means.
Yeah, that's true. He's got to rely on pictures from the 90s.
So. TD Lane says that he managed to get hacking so pissed that he muted him. I consider it a victory. As indeed. Yes, bravo, sir. That
I don't know how you do it, RJ. I can't bear to be in those 49 plus conversations.
I triage a lot of them. I don't necessarily have to comment on every one of them, because a lot of it is just a ping pong match. What I like to get into is an enfilade. And I will type that out again. You can Google what the damn word is. It's a military term, but it's where you've got people, two marksmen firing from different directions so that they're putting people in crosshairs. And in a scholarly discussion, it's you're in a field with, say, a dozen wackaloon creationists, none of whom you will ever be able to persuade. And then there's maybe a dozen or more people who are kind of watching this and haven't made up their mind or whatever. They haven't been talking in the conversation. They're just observing it.
I actually had that
And
happen to me at LSU one time in
yeah,
Baton Rouge.
and
Yeah.
yeah. Well, tell about that.
Oh, oh shucks. Well, we have these. There were different groups of creationists that came to LSU. There was a group of like Protestants from Mississippi. There was one traveling group that went around the country, and I was talking to. They took turns yelling at the kids, and so when one of them was sitting down, I came over and I kind of asked him about baraminology, and I was like, "Oh, do you think dogs are, all dogs are related?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, do you think dogs are related to bears?" He was like, "Oh, I don't know about that." And I said, "Well, bears and dogs share these characteristics. They also share these characteristics with weasels and seals, and they meet up with cats." And he was kind of blown away by all of this. And I talked to him for a little while, but after I was done talking to him, as I was starting to walk away, another student came over and said, "Hey, how do you know all that? How are you rattling all that stuff off the top of your head?" And just like,
Yeah,
"Oh,
because you
well."
know stuff. Yeah, and what an enfilade could be done in a live context like that.
Hmm.
You were going solo, and I've done kind of solo things as well. But an enfilade involves more than one person, and so what you have is somebody who is asking you questions, and you are answering them, or you are asking them questions, and they're giving you an answer. And this is going on not with the creationists, but in front of them.
Hmm.
And so now you are exchanging information in front of the people who need to maybe know about the information, some of whom are Tortukan, so it's just bouncing off of the mind shell. But in other cases, there are people that are going to be going, hmm, and they may end up trying to investigate some of this stuff on their own. Some of them may not ever change their mind, but some of them you might have planted a seed to where, gosh, there's all this stuff out there. And you're seeing that in a conversation when you're explaining stuff. So in an enfilade that I'm looking at on Twitter, of course, it's a much more restricted environment because you've only got the 280 characters, but you can convey a lot and you can bring up individual topics. And in some cases, then you want to deploy a particular link to an actual technical paper on stuff. So say somebody might bring up an issue, they didn't mention a technical citation, and you can go, oh, yes, there's been a lot of work on that. For example, bloop, and you put that in. Now you've suddenly raised the bar on the level of discourse beyond just nya, nya, nya. You're now at a higher level, and hopefully will be elevating the methodology of the other people in the enfilade. So it's you can do it with as many people as you like, and of course you want to always remain polite and witty. If you've got a sharp tongue on there, you can always find ways of turning material around. But I don't want to just get in there and insult people, although there are times when that's all I need to do, because I've criticized them umpteen times. Hacking is like that. Like hacking at one point made the mistake of phrasing something that says, well, I just don't understand where you're getting this argument from. And I says, oh, hacking, it's just that you don't understand. That's your problem. and because we've had a long exchange with him, and there's been a lot of people in the thread that have seen the long exchange, then that can operate. But you don't want to start off with that kind of a thing. You want to earn your right to drop an anvil on their toe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't often make it to that point because I either have something to do, and so I just mute the conversation, or they tag a whole bunch of people and I say, sorry, not doing this.
Well, and I'm also keeping track of the various contacts and things that I do. Once in a while, we bump into higher echelon anti-evolutionists on Twitter that aren't active necessarily, but yet they're people I've already got in my reference bibliography, and I take a note of that. And it's a nice little area because you can social media is a place where you're putting on a persona and you are conveying what you want to convey. And so you're looking into their head as to what they think is important and what they think isn't. And you'll find that a lot of the creationists are very monotonously familiar. They're not bringing new arguments to the table. And often, then, if you reach the level where you are well versed in what the apologetic literature is, that's meaning reading them, then that means you can respond more efficiently that way. The worst case to do is to jump into a battle where you have no idea what they're talking about or who they're talking about. They can name drop, for example, and this one fellow Resist, who is a very conservative guy, and he's very politically conservative, and he's going on a lot on Trump's policies and other things, but he's also a creationist. And at one point, he's going on about the resurrection, and he lobbed. Obviously, he was very impressed with this. It was the dissertation for his PhD from Lacona, who I immediately
Mike Lacona.
I immediately
Wow.
recognized as a co-author of a book with Bill Dembski. So he belongs in that intelligent design, anthropic reasoning kind of orbit. Well, again and again, Resist keeps dropping that thing. You don't even get past the first page of it, do you? And I said, no, I actually did get past the first page of it. I checked to see whether or not he mentioned the Matthew, Luke, genealogy nativity train wreck, and he didn't. And therefore, he's leaving out relevant information about the reliability of Matthew and Luke as gospels, and therefore the reliability of the gospels in general, and therefore whether they can be taken as absolutely valid evidence for the resurrection. This is not trivial. And has he responded and discussed on any of that? Of course not.
Yeah, that would some might say that might make an interesting topic to think about in the future, wouldn't it, RJ?
I think so, indeed. Yes,
I think
because
that would make a very intriguing topic.
There's you'll find at my tip website the chapter 6 on "'Cause the Bible Tells Me So." And Puffalopica says, how would you expect the YECer with their kinds to explain mantis flies? They wouldn't.
No, God, no.
They try to avoid insects. In fact, virtually all the apologetics I've seen on insects are, gee, isn't this a wonderful thing of nature? Look how complicated the fill in the blank is.
Yeah.
So they mention insects in that context. The bombardier beetle is a classic example.
Because they're not vertebrates. They're not interesting. How many creationists, would, if you ask a creationist, a sampling of creationists, how many kinds of tunicates are there?
Yeah.
You're going to hear crickets.
or let's work on those. What did Adam call the nematodes? He named all the animal kinds supposedly in Eden.
Right.
How many nematodes were there, and how did he name them?
How many?
And just don't think about that.
How many different kinds of chinorynchs are there?
Yeah, and you're of course as aware as I am that, holy moly, if you think that it's troublesome keeping track of a few thousand species of mammal, wait till you bump into invertebrates and and all of these little squishy protozoa. Holy moly, they're just incredibly diverse. And in fact, most of the research that relates to working out the deep rooting of metazoa are dealing with those, because they're very early branchers, and they're telling more systematically than what you're finding with wee boring little mammals that come along only in the last quarter of a billion years.
Oh yeah, I've been waist deep in produce literature for a few months now for my own secret project, but it is interesting because there are protists more closely related to us than they are to other protists, which is kind of weird if you're a creationist.
And they're in fact opening a giant window. Remember, every one of the taxa that we're looking at are already existing. They're living species of organisms. But yet, if they've got a history of their divergence from a common ancestor 1 billion years ago, or 1.5 billion, or maybe even 2 billion years ago, that's a gigantic ghost lineage that's represented in the fossils, represented in their genes. And the biology, the interactions of things, what receptor systems they use, what cell transduction mechanisms, and all the rest. And so it's a tough row for this kind of paleogenomic archaeology to go on, but that's a cutting edge. And I can anticipate more and more scientists getting engaged in it because, of course, they've got tools to handle the genetic data on a scale far vaster than what was available 15 or 20 years ago. And so they've got the tools available. Now it's just a matter of applying it. So this is an area that's going to be just more hair to pull out for creationists that they're going to have to try to figure out. Because theoretically, even if not on the ark, every one of them would have to have been created kinds. They're forced into that straitjacket. And it's a revealing thing about the intelligent design movement and all of the remaining dregs of old Earth creationism that are around there. There's not many. They just don't think about this. They've got that other than say Ross scratching his head once in a while as to whether or not Neanderthals were soulish or not. That all of that vast layer on layer on layer of time isn't something that really entertains their interest. And you have to wonder, gosh, why not? Because they theoretically would be God's creation just as much. A Kynorhynch and a Luciferin are just as much God's creation as wildebeests and brain parasites. But nevertheless, they just don't think about it much. And that's telling you about how their brains are compartmentalizing their curiosity, are restraining in interest. And that's the opposite of what scientists do.
Yeah,
That's telling
absolutely. Yeah, it is. It is very interesting the amount of literature on protists that is out there. It's crazy. It is crazy
Yeah. I
stuff.
mean, and because of your covering it in our work, boy, I could go, yipes, look at all this material. And then that connects up with other material what the Loki Archaea, or what the hell are
Loki
they?
Archaea. Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
Asgard superphylum, which
Yeah,
is now.
they're a hot item in
Yeah.
current analytical work. And then, of course, I still get the material on good old Volvox and Matt Herron stuff. That this is just delicious material that keeps on expanding all the way down the line. So
Yeah.
for anybody looking at that, anybody who wants to dive into that origins or bust issue, and this is just as true for creationists as evolutionists, that's data you got to account for. You have to deal with all of those little weird, creepy, crawly things, as well as the nice, cute little, cuddly little animals that they're feeding on board the Ark in the Ark Encounter.
Yeah, that's true.
So looks like there were no questions or anything on here. Hopefully my sound remains fairly stable on that. I'll say again how sad I am, and I'm sure everybody that knows Cy and the little pug are going to be thinking about how dreary and less exciting life is without Cy there to harangue us for talking over one another. And I think that will do for the show. We can say au revoir until next week. Thanks, everybody. Check out my website. Get Evolution Slam Dunk if you like fiction. Get Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. I'm busy working on all of that stuff. And hopefully we're going to have some Christmas presents for people. Wait the books.
All right. Killing the stream in 5,